On the coldest night of the year, under the harsh glare of emergency floodlights, a massive white German shepherd stood guard over Hope Haven, Maine. His fur was matted with blood, his eyes fierce and alert. Despite his injuries, he remained unwavering, a sentinel in the blizzard's chaos. Inside Heaven's only medical clinic, Dr. James Mitchell worked tirelessly to save 3 children trapped by a blizzard that had come to symbolize the town's harsh reality. But just months earlier, this dog had been a mere stray, dragging himself through the snow, wounded and alone. He had been found by Sarah Thompson, an elderly widow whose life was fading just as the town around her seemed to be. She had no idea that taking in this dog would not only transform her final days, but also save an entire community. When Sarah's last breath faded into the bitter winter air, she whispered words that would haunt Hope Haven for years to come. He was never just a dog. He was sent to finish what I couldn't. Welcome to HeartForce channel, where you and I find more meaning in life through stories about dogs. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you are listening to this video from. And if you have any stories about your dog, feel free to share them with everyone. And so, the story of Kajani, the dog who became a hero, began not with a noble birth, but from an act of kindness on a snowy night. It would be a journey of redemption, loyalty, and love that would alter the fate of an entire town. Hope Haven, Maine, had once been a proud community, a place where families thrived and the streets echoed with the laughter of children. But as Sarah Thompson sat in her Victorian home on Cherry Hill, she couldn't help but notice the slow decay around her. The town had changed. The factory had closed. The streets once filled with the proud waving of American flags were now lined with boarded-up windows. The light in the town had faded. Sarah, now 72, was one of the last to stay in Hope Haven. Her once vibrant community had shrunk, its heart long gone. She filled her days tending to her garden and volunteering at the local clinic, though even those small gestures seemed to go unnoticed by the few who remained. No one invited her over for Sunday dinner anymore. The loneliness weighed heavy on her, but she didn't mind. She had seen loss before, too much loss. The greatest of which had come on a summer day in 2005 when Sarah's daughter, Emily, and her family were lost in Hurricane Katrina's fury. It was a pain that cut deep, and though the town had tried to offer comfort, it was clear they didn't know how to handle such grief. The invitations stopped. The visits became less frequent. Soon, Sarah was more of a forgotten relic than the cherished pillar of the community she once was. Then came the winter of 2024, the coldest the town had ever seen. Hope Haven's problems deepened. The last factory in town shut its doors, and rumors of drugs infiltrating the community began to spread. Sarah watched from her porch as the lights of her neighbors flickered out one by one. Families moving away, desperate for better opportunities. Yet despite everything, Sarah stayed. She kept her porch light on every night, a beacon of stubborn hope in a town that had all but given up. She had no idea that the real change in her life would come not with the spring thaw, but on the coldest night of winter, when a wounded German shepherd would drag himself into her yard, bringing with him a secret that would change the course of Hope Haven's future. It was the evening of January 15th, 2024, when the storm hit. The thermometer outside Sarah's kitchen window read 15 degrees below zero, and the wind howled like a freight train. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, warming her hands on a cup of chamomile tea, when a motion sensor in her backyard suddenly lit up. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as the snow swirled in the wind, she caught a glimpse of something much larger. Instinctively, she grabbed her coat and flashlight. Dr. Mitchell, the town's only doctor, would have scolded her for going outside at her age, but Sarah had been a nurse for decades. She knew that hesitation could cost lives. Stepping onto the porch, she was nearly knocked over by the fierce wind. Her flashlight beam cut through the swirling snow, revealing a trail of blood on the ground. Sarah's heart raced. She knew something was out there, and as she made her way down the steps and into the yard, she found him, collapsed against the garden shed. The massive dog lay there, his white fur nearly invisible against the snow, except where it was stained crimson. He was enormous, even for a German shepherd. But it wasn't his size that caught Sarah's attention. It was his eyes. Golden brown and intelligent. They met hers with a look of exhaustion, but also recognition. "Oh, you poor thing," Sarah whispered, her voice steady and calm. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The dog made no move to resist as she approached. His muscles were trembling with cold, pain, or both. Sarah knelt beside him, noting the military-grade tags around his neck. They were scratched, almost beyond recognition, but she could make out the words, "Operation Guardian." She didn't hesitate. Sarah wrapped him in her coat, helping him to his feet. She had no idea what he was running from, or who he had been. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let him die alone in the snow. Inside her kitchen, with the wind still howling outside, Sarah worked tirelessly to care for the massive dog she had named Kajani. The storm raged on, but Sarah's focus never wavered as she set to work using every ounce of her nursing experience. Kajani's wounds were severe, deep gashes along his flank, his left paw badly swollen, and his body covered in scars from battles fought long before she had found him. His white fur, once pure, was now matted with blood and dirt, but his eyes remained sharp, watching Sarah with an unwavering attention. She was exhausted. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, but this was familiar territory. The world outside might be falling apart, but in her kitchen there was purpose. As Sarah cleaned and bandaged his wounds, she couldn't help but notice the military tags around his neck. The words Operation Guardian were still partially legible. Sarah knew that Operation Guardian wasn't something any dog should be a part of. Yet, she also knew that Kajani wasn't just any dog. He had been trained for something far greater than the mundane, something that had made him the protector of Hope Haven, just when the town needed it most. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving only an eerie quiet. The sun began to creep through the snow, and Sarah looked down at Kajani, who had finally drifted into a restful sleep, his head resting gently against her knee. She stroked his fur as she thought about her own life, how she had spent decades caring for others, only to be abandoned by those she had loved most. She had been alone for so long, with only the quiet hum of memories to keep her company. But Kajani had changed that. She had always been a caretaker, always the one to give. But now, she realized that she needed someone to take care of her. She wasn't sure how long Kajani would stay, but she knew that, for as long as he did, she would be different. He had already begun to heal the part of her heart she had thought was beyond saving. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Kajani developed a quiet routine. She spoke to him, telling him about her life, about her lost family, about her love for Hope Haven. In return, Kajani listened intently, offering her the kind of companionship she hadn't experienced in years. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. One morning, as Sarah changed his bandages, she noticed something strange. Kajani responded to hand signals, exactly the way she had seen military medics use with their dogs. He didn't flinch when she cleaned his wounds, and his posture was always alert, even when he was resting. It was clear Kajani wasn't just a stray. He had been part of something much bigger than either of them had realized. But it wasn't just his training that fascinated Sarah. It was the way he seemed to recognize her needs before she even spoke them. When she began to feel dizzy from the treatments, Kajani would position himself to steady her, standing beside her like a steadfast sentry. If her strength faltered, he would lean against her, offering his silent support. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Kajani suddenly rose from his spot by the fireplace. His hackles raised, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, standing and walking to the window. The streets were empty, covered in fresh snow, but Kajani's body language told her something was wrong. The air seemed thick with an unspoken warning. She grabbed the phone and dialed Dr. Mitchell's number. "Sarah, you okay?" Dr. Mitchell's voice came through, his tone filled with concern. "James," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with warning. "I think something's coming. I don't know what it is, but you should keep an eye out. There's something in the air." Dr. Mitchell hesitated on the line. Sarah, lock your doors tonight. We've had reports of strange vehicles circling the outskirts of town. It might be nothing, but I'm just saying, be careful. You don't need to be out there on your own. I'll be fine, James, she said, her voice calm. I'm not alone anymore. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the unease lingered. Sarah stepped into the quiet streets of Hope Haven, Kajani at her side. She noticed the whispers, the stares. People in town had begun to take notice of the large, white dog walking beside her. A dog unlike any other. It didn't help that Kajani's presence seemed to radiate power, an energy that was both comforting and intimidating. At Wilson's pharmacy, Martha Wilson dropped her reading glasses in surprise when she saw them enter. Good Lord, Sarah Thompson, she gasped. That's not a dog. That's a horse. Sarah smiled faintly. He's harmless. Martha, he's with me. But even as Sarah reassured the townsfolk, she could feel the growing tension. Some people feared him, while others simply didn't understand him. He was unlike any dog they had ever seen, and that made them uneasy. As they walked past, Sarah noticed the whispers beginning. Dangerous dog. She overheard one woman mutter under her breath. What's she doing with a thing like that? The town was divided. There were those who were grateful to Sarah for taking care of the massive dog, but there were others who feared him, who didn't trust what they didn't understand. Later that day, Margaret Baker, who headed the town council, cornered Sarah outside the post office. Sarah, dear, Margaret said with forced concern, there are regulations about dangerous animals. Perhaps you should consider sending Kajani to the shelter in Augusta. Sarah met her gaze with quiet authority. Kajani stays with me. He's a service animal, and he's here to stay. The tension between the two women was palpable, but Sarah stood her ground. She had no intention of giving up Kajani. He wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, and he had already proven his worth. The question that remained was, what was he protecting them from? By February, Sarah's health had started to decline, but her resolve remained unshaken. The storm had passed, leaving a fragile peace in its wake, but something still hung in the air, a tension that Sarah couldn't shake. Kajani had proven his loyalty time and time again, but what was he really guarding? And who, or what, was he running from? The questions had started to gnaw at her, and as she watched the town slowly recover from the winter's grip, she noticed strange things happening. Late-night visitors, unmarked cars parked along the outskirts of town, whispers that had grown louder, even in the church pews. People were talking, and then there were the strange men, suited, professional. They didn't belong in Hope Haven. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on her porch, bundled in blankets to ward off the chill, she saw them again. This time, they were at the end of her driveway, two men in dark suits standing beside an unmarked black SUV. They were talking to Sheriff Robert Anderson, their words too quiet to hear, but the tension was thick. It wasn't normal for the sheriff to be caught in such a conversation. Kajani stood alert beside her, his golden eyes trained on the men. His posture was rigid, protective, but not aggressive. Sarah felt her chest tighten, the familiar weight of suspicion settling in. The sheriff caught her eye, giving her a brief nod before turning back to the men. Sarah could tell from a look on his face that this was no ordinary visit. There was something more going on. She felt it in her bones. Later that evening, as she sat by the fire, the knock at her door was inevitable. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Dr. James Mitchell stood in the doorway, his face tight with concern. Behind him, the suited men stood waiting, their eyes cold, calculating. Sarah, we need to talk, Dr. Mitchell said quietly, stepping inside. His eyes flicked toward Kajani, who was already standing between them, his body a silent wall of protection. Are these the men you've been telling me about? Sarah asked, her voice steady. She already knew the answer. Dr. Mitchell nodded grimly. They're looking for Kajani. They have questions about his past. They're not here for a simple dog. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who are they? And why do they care about him so much? Dr. Mitchell hesitated, casting a furtive glance at the men. They're from the Department of Defense. They've been tracking military dogs from a program called Operation Guardian. It's classified, Sarah, but something's wrong. Something doesn't add up. The air in the room grew heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Her thoughts raced. Kajani, a military asset? A dog trained for something far darker than she had imagined? She had never asked him about his past, but now it seemed as though that past was coming for them. The taller of the two men spoke, his voice low and authoritative. "Miss Thompson, we need to take the dog with us. He's military property. You're harboring a national security risk." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had never been one to back down, not in her nursing days, and certainly not now. She looked the man squarely in the eyes. "This dog saved my life," she said firmly. "He's not your property. He's my protector, my companion. He stays." The man's expression tightened, but Sarah didn't flinch. She could see in his eyes that he wasn't used to being defied. Kajani growled softly, his massive frame looming behind her. A silent promise that no one would take her away from him. The men hesitated, and Sarah could tell they weren't expecting her resistance. They seemed to reassess the situation before speaking again. "This time we're measured." "We'll be back," the taller man said, his voice cold. "And when we return, we'll have the proper authorization." Dr. Mitchell exchanged a quick look with Sarah before turning to the men. "I'd advise you to leave, gentlemen. And I'll remind you, Sarah has every right to keep Kajani. He's been legally registered as her emotional support animal." The men nodded, though Sarah could see the frustration in their eyes. They turned and walked out the door. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. Something far bigger was at play, and they were all caught in the middle of it. As the door closed behind them, Dr. Mitchell turned to Sarah, his face pale. "You've got to be careful, Sarah. These people aren't who they say they are. They're not just here for Kajani. They want something else." Sarah's mind raced, and she glanced at Kajani, who was sitting quietly by her side, watching the men with an alert gaze. She could feel the weight of his presence, a steady reassurance that he would protect her no matter what. "Whatever they want, they won't get it," Sarah said softly. She reached down and scratched Kajani's ear. "We've faced worse than this, haven't we, old friend?" Kajani's eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt as though the two of them were sharing a secret, a bond forged through hardship and shared purpose. He wasn't just a dog. He was more than that. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that Kajani wasn't the only one with secrets. The town of Hope Haven had its own mysteries, too, and they were all about to be laid bare. The storm that had battered Hope Haven for months wasn't over yet. The quiet had settled over the town, but the threat still loomed, creeping closer to the town's fragile heart. It was February now, and the chill in the air felt more biting than ever, not from the winter, but from the heavy secrets that everyone was keeping. Sarah had been following the news from the safety of her porch. But even as the town began to return to normal, things felt wrong. The news outlets mentioned more black SUVs, more unmarked vehicles. Sarah knew these men weren't just looking for a military dog. They were looking for something bigger. Dr. Mitchell had become more of a regular visitor, not just to check on Sarah's health, but to warn her. He'd been getting odd calls from a sheriff, strange inquiries from government sources, all looking for Kajani. The tension in the town had begun to rise. Sarah sat in her chair, watching Kajani, who had grown more vigilant with each passing day. He never let his guard down, always alert, his body tense with a quiet readiness. Despite her weakening health, Sarah found strength in his presence. He had become her anchor, the silent guardian she never expected to find in her final days. But with every passing day, Sarah knew the clock was ticking. Her own battle with cancer had taken its toll. She was growing weaker, her body giving in to the disease she couldn't fight. But even in her frail state, she could still feel the pulse of something deeper, something stronger than her illness. It was the town's heartbeat, the pulse of life she had been trying to protect. One morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of scraping tires against snow. She opened her eyes slowly, trying to focus on the world around her, but everything felt muted, blurred by the haze of illness. She struggled to sit up, her breathing labored, but Kajani was there, standing by her side, as if he had known the moment she would wake. She glanced out the window, her heart pounding as she saw the black SUV pull up once more. The men were back. They stepped out, their dark suits unmistakable. Sarah's pulse quickened, and Kajani's growl was low, threatening. He stood by her, unwavering. The knock at the door came quickly, but Sarah wasn't afraid. There was a part of her that had already made her decision. No more running, no more hiding. She had lived her life for others, and now, as her time ran out, she would do what she could to protect her town and the legacy she would leave behind. She opened the door to find the two men standing there, their faces cold and unreadable. "Ms. Thompson, we need to talk," the taller man said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This has gone far enough." "I'm listening," Sarah replied, her voice steady. Kajani stood beside her, his massive frame a shield, his eyes fixed on the men. "We know what's going on," the other man spoke, stepping forward. "We know about Kajani's past, and we're here to make sure he doesn't cause any more problems for you or the town. You're harboring a weapon, a dangerous animal. A weapon." The word stung. It was hard to hear her protector reduced to something so cold, so inhuman. Sarah's grip tightened around the doorframe as she stood tall, unbroken. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "He's not just a dog. He's my guardian, and he's been more of a hero to this town than you ever will be." The taller man stepped back, eyeing Kajani warily. "We're not here to argue. We're here to do what's necessary. You're endangering yourself, and you're endangering the community. The government has classified this operation, and you have no right to keep him here." Sarah looked at the men, her mind sharp despite the fatigue weighing her down. She thought of the people in Hope Haven, the elderly who relied on her, the children who had found courage in Kajani's protection. She thought of the moments when she had witnessed kindness over fear, when the town had stood together, not divided. "Leave," Sarah said firmly. "You don't know him, and you don't understand. This town will stand by me. I won't let you take him. He's not your weapon. He's a healer, and the people of Hope Haven need him more than they need you." The men exchanged a look, frustration flickering in their eyes. But they hesitated. For a moment, it seemed as though they might relent. But then, one of them reached into his jacket, pulling out a piece of paper. "This is your last warning, Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice turning colder. "Either you hand him over, or we'll take further action." But Sarah didn't flinch. Kajani's growl deepened. It was a warning, one that didn't need words. "Do what you will," Sarah replied, "but you won't take him. Not without going through me." The men looked at each other again, uncertainty creeping in. Sarah's gaze never left them. Kajani, her guardian, stood like a stone wall beside her, ready to protect his charge, ready to do whatever it took. After a long moment of silence, the taller man sighed. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "This isn't over. Ms. Thompson." He turned, signaling his companion to follow. They left without another word, the tension in the air still thick, but Sarah didn't feel fear, only resolve. As the men retreated down her driveway, Sarah stood there for a moment, her hands resting on Kajani's massive shoulders. His warmth was a constant reminder of the loyalty that had saved her life, that had saved the town's soul. Dr. Mitchell arrived shortly after, his eyes full of concern. "Sarah, you need to be careful. They're not going to give up. This isn't just about Kajani anymore. It's about something much bigger. We need to make sure the town is prepared." But Sarah wasn't worried about the town. She knew that Hope Haven would rise to the occasion. She had seen it happen before. This wasn't just about Kajani or the people who didn't understand him. This was about the soul of the town. She looked at Dr. Mitchell, her voice firm. "I fought too long to give up now. The town will stand. We'll face whatever comes together." As the days passed, the storm clouds that had been hanging over Hope Haven began to break. Sarah's health continued to deteriorate, but her resolve remained strong. The small, stubborn town that she had spent her life serving was beginning to change, and she could feel it deep within her. This was no longer just about her battle with illness. This was a battle for the soul of Hope Haven. Sarah had watched as Kajani had slowly, without fanfare, become a hero to the town. The children, once afraid of the large, white dog, now ran to him as he sat proudly in the park. The elderly residents in the nursing home were comforted by his presence, his quiet strength bringing peace to their troubled hearts. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was protecting the very essence of the community she loved. But the shadows were drawing closer. The men in dark suits were back, and they had brought more muscle this time. Their determination to seize Kajani, to extract him from Hope Haven, was growing stronger. They had threatened to take action, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. They would not win. Not as long as she had breath in her body, and not as long as Kajani stood beside her. It was late one evening when the final confrontation occurred. Sarah had just finished writing in her journal, chronicling the slow, painful days of her illness, when she heard the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Her heart clenched. She knew what was coming. Kajani stood at attention, his powerful frame tense, his eyes sharp and alert. He could sense it too. The knock at the door came shortly after. Sarah didn't hesitate. This time, they were ready for a fight. "Miss Thompson, this is your final warning," the taller man said, his voice cold and commanding. "We've tried to handle this peacefully, but you're making this far more difficult than it needs to be. Hand over the dog." Now, Sarah stood firm. She had spent her entire life fighting for others, fighting for the people of Hope Haven, fighting for the weak and the forgotten. And she would not back down now. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the weakness in her body. "He's not a weapon. He's a guardian. He's the reason this town is still standing. You can't just take him because you don't understand him." The men didn't respond at first, their gazes flicking from Sarah to Kajani, who stood between them with a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. She had raised this dog not just to protect her, but to protect all of Hope Haven. "We don't want to hurt you, Sarah," the shorter man said, his voice softer. "But this is a national security matter. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Sarah replied, her eyes hardening. "And you don't get to take him. He stays here, with me, with the people who love him." Kajani let out a deep, protective growl, his massive form blocking the doorway. The men hesitated, their faces showing the uncertainty they had tried so hard to hide. "Do you really think you can stop this?" the taller man said, his voice rising in frustration. "This isn't about the dog anymore. This is about protecting secrets that go beyond this town." Sarah looked them both in the eye, her voice unwavering. "Maybe this town has secrets, but it also has heart, and that's something you can't take." The standoff stretched, neither side willing to back down. But just as the tension reached its peak, a sound came from behind them, siren lights flashing in the distance, cutting through the night. Sarah's pulse quickened. The sheriff's car, Dr. Mitchell's SUV. But it wasn't just them. From the shadows, people Sarah had known for years began to emerge. Neighbors, old friends, the residents of the nursing home who had heard the news. The people of Hope Haven had come, not to fight, but to stand with her, to stand with Kajani. The sheriff, standing tall and calm, walked up to the men. "You've overstayed your welcome," he said, his voice firm. "And this is my jurisdiction. If you want to take him, you'll have to go through all of us." The men didn't know how to respond. They had expected resistance from Sarah, but they hadn't counted on an entire community rallying behind her. The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't just about Kajani. This was about a town that had been forgotten, a community that had been left to decay, and yet had found the strength to rise when it mattered most. For a moment, everything was still. The men in suits, the sheriff, Dr. Mitchell. "This is a national security matter, but not in the way you think. It's about protecting what matters most, each other." With that, the men in suits stepped back. They had come with threats, with force, but they hadn't anticipated the power of a community united. And as the lights of their vehicles faded into the distance, Sarah allowed herself to exhale. The battle had been won. Later that evening, as the town settled back into its quiet rhythm, Sarah sat on her porch with Kajani by her side. The weight of the confrontation still hung in the air. But there was a sense of peace now, a sense of purpose. "I did it," Sarah whispered to Kajani, her voice soft but filled with pride. "We did it, old friend." Kajani rested his massive head on her lap. his eyes watching the quiet town around them. The war for Hope Haven was not over, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the weight of her mission lift. She had given everything she could to save this town, to protect the people she loved, and in doing so, she had ensured that Hope Haven would rise again. As I reflect on Sarah and Kajani's journey, I am reminded that true healing comes not just from medicine, but from the strength of community. Sarah's fight wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting the legacy of what made her town great. She chose to stand firm, no matter the cost, and in the end, that courage became the catalyst for change. This story teaches us that even in our darkest moments, when life seems impossible and the world turns its back on us, there's always a way to rise together. Just like Sarah and Kajani, we must stand for what is right, protect the ones we love, and never give up on our community, no matter the challenges we face. What do you think of this story? How do you relate to the themes of community, protection, and standing up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to HeartForce for more inspirational stories. Stay tuned for the next video.